what the hell is this? Look at this. There's a radiator mount in the sidewall that points straight into the glass. What? It goes straight into the glass. Why? This is the Thermaltake Level 20 RS, and it's an interesting case. It genuinely is very interesting because Thermaltake was that close to having a top performer on some of the thermal charts in our benchmarks that are coming up later in this video. And this case ends up with its two 200 mil front fans and its very cheap 120 mil rear fan. It ends up being actually sometimes competitive. But the trouble is that Thermaltake fell for the classic ploy of doubling up on front mesh, where there's a mesh front and then a dust filter, and the wires of the filter happen to line up with the holes of the mesh front in a lot of instances. But we're going to go through the whole case because that's a resolvable issue if you remove the filter yourself, and it can be potentially competitive. So let's get through the review. Before that, this video is brought to you by EVGA's RTX 2060 KO. We previously reviewed the RTX 2060 KO model for its fused down RTX 2080 die that uniquely benefited Blender and some professional applications, offering better performance than expected in some pro workloads while offering usual strong RTX 2060 performance for gaming. The RTX 2060 KO also includes the game Deliver Us the Moon for free with EVGA GeForce RTX cards. EVGA is actively restocking its RTX 2060 KO with new dies, which you can find linked in the description below. The Thermaltake Level 20 RS is part of a resurgence of cases that go for the attempt at high airflow with 200mm fans. Sometimes this works out exceptionally, but it all depends on the case. And if you're trying to use 200s, which do have a specific look to them that is absolutely appealing to the right audience, but if you're trying to use 200s, you really have to design the case around it. It's not like other fans where you can generally reliably throw a 120 in there and expect a certain baseline of performance. 200s, by the nature of being larger, mean that, well, one, you get more hole to pull air through, so that's potentially a positive, except there's a whole hell of a lot less static pressure and just less pressure in general for pushing air through the case and moving it. So you run into the challenge where, as would be expected, a slower spinning large object just can't create the sort of jet flow that you would get out of a 120 or a 140 fan or something like that. So this is definitely part of a bit of a trend, and it's not a bad one, but there's a right and a wrong way to execute it. Thermaltake's sort of in between, where, as you'll see in the thermal charts later, they end up in a non-competitive and uncompetitive position in some charts, but actually an extremely competitive position in others, and it just depends on which numbers you're looking at. The HAF-esque case is following the H500P original case, which was a tragic failure at launch. You see a lot of 200mm RGB front intake fans. Cooler Master made a lot of other H500 cases after that one. We've seen a bit of a recovery in interest in 180mm case fans from SilverStone, where they made the Air Penetrators, which are some of the best fans ever made. And so this is part of a trend that can be a good thing. The Level 20 RS here does reuse tooling from some previous cases from Thermaltake. It's not the Level 20 MT, though, that we reviewed in 2018. This Level 20 does use mesh, so it's a bit different there. Let's get into Patrick's build notes. We'll talk about some of the ups and downs of this case, and the mesh double stacking is definitely a major item to focus on. Then we'll go through the thermal performance. As we've mentioned in past reviews, we're getting a little tired of power supply shrouds, so it's a pleasant change to see a case with a half shroud that's removable. There are only two screws that hold it in place, so it's very easy to take out, although putting it back in requires lining up some delicate metal tabs just right. That matters here, since the space under the power supply shroud can't be accessed from the motherboard side as it usually can be. Instead, users must remove the shroud, install the power supply from the interior of the case, thread cables behind the motherboard tray, and replace the shroud if desired. This reminds us of cases that came out around the same time the HAF X did, so that'd be circa 2007 to 2011 era of case design. It makes it somewhat odd that the power supply can be inserted from the back of the case as well. It's a good feature, but it's a bit redundant here with the way they've done it. The ARGB lighting is one of our least favorite aspects of this case. We don't like to pollute our test bench with bloatware, so we tested with built-in RGB lighting controls for the case, the physical hardware buttons. The built-in lighting on the Level 20 RS kind of sucks. The animated patterns aren't smooth at all at lower speeds, and although the solid colors and faster animations look fine on the fans, The slightly off-center labels make them look unpleasantly wobbly no matter what. The only other lighting in the case is a weird little strip, which we're calling a WLS, we're filing for a trademark on that, across the top of the front panel. The whole thing seems like an afterthought, which is reinforced by, as usual, repurposing what was clearly a reset button as a makeshift RGB control button, and the fact that the RGB controller itself is slapped in the middle of the path of an important cable cutout. Points are, however, awarded for including an RGB controller. Points are also awarded for having preset patterns, as well as accepting ARGB control from the motherboard, and points are deducted for being bad. The controller uses non-standard connections that combine RGB and fan power into one header, so there's no way to control the fan speeds. This is something that Lee also did in the past and drove us crazy then too. Since the controller only takes input for the LEDs, you end up sort of stuck with this solution unless you buy different fans. At least the rear exhaust fan is a normal 3-pin design, and it can be connected to something else for control instead. We've long ago ceased to test vertical GPU layouts in standard mid-towers since we proved our point ages ago. The conclusion is almost invariably that it's a bad idea with air-cooled cards. There were maybe 2 or 3 exceptions to that, and all of those featured brackets that were fully rotatable for all the PCIe slots, where you could seat the card sufficiently far back from the panel if the case is deep enough so that it could still breathe. All of that said, the Level 20 RS has the best possible version of the vertical layout. It's similar to that cable mod adapter that actually kind of works well. The entire block of expansion cards can be rotated sideways, meaning that the card can be mounted as close to the motherboard, which is good, or the side panel, which is bad, as desired. This does also mean that if one add-in card is installed vertically, all the add-in cards must be installed vertically. But it's better than smashing the GPU intake fans against the glass panel and overheating it. If you're going water cooling, this point doesn't really matter that much. Thermaltake gets credit for one of the better vertical GPU layout implementations, and of course, if you did want to go water cooling, you're basically going for looks at that point. You're not worrying about fans on the card, so feel free to smash it against the glass so you can see it better. There are some major assembly issues going on with the small metal mesh sections of the top panel. The corners aren't fully seated into the plastic housing, which seems more an issue of an overly elaborate design than a lack of care. Removing the top panel and examining its interior reveals that each of the rounded corner pieces is a separate piece that's screwed into the main panel during assembly, with tool marks revealing just how much manual labor it takes to get everything fitted together properly. The whole thing is vastly overcomplicated in service of nothing. At least all the decorative flanges and ribs make the panels fairly solid and inflexible. The front of the top panel has 2 big divots taken out of it where the power buttons and USB ports are located, but this is a decorative choice rather than a functional one. The top of the radiator mount is needlessly obstructed by this. Although the rails on the chassis extend all the way to the front of the case, they're partially covered by the extremely large I/O housing. We would much more prefer a more conventional layout with the I/O in place of the WLS, as we called it. Filtering in the Level 20 RS is overkill, something that we've been complaining about with Thermaltake cases for several years running. The G21 was one of the most egregious offenders where Thermaltake actually triple meshed it up. The top panel is mesh, and the front panel is mesh here, and all the little nooks and crannies of the case around the sides are also mesh. They'll do a fine job of filtering dust on their own. That's apparently not good enough though for Thermaltake, and they've sandwiched a second filter layer inside the panels. We removed this layer for one of the thermal tests shown later in the review, but certainly it isn't designed to be removable. Combining restrictive filters and fans with extremely low static pressure is a bad idea, and that's what happens when you have 200mm fans. Double mesh for filtration can be excusable, but the case needs to be designed around it. Shoving 200mm fans in, which are naturally low static pressure in PC applications, means that you're especially limited where 120s might have been acceptable. The one filter that is designed to be removable is on the bottom of the case, but it ejects from the rear, making it inconvenient to pull out if the case is backed up against a wall. Side panel attachment is good. It's simple. Both sides are identical and interchangeable, and there aren't any holes drilled through the glass. We wish the thumb screws on the back were captive, and we wish they didn't come from the factory torqued down so hard that we couldn't unscrew them without a driver. But that's par for the course by now, and everybody does it, especially NZXT. But their recommended solution is to yank hard. To each their own. The top and front panels of the Level 20 RS require concerningly sharp yanks to get off as well, but as a consequence, they fit tight and flush. Be warned, we now know from experience that the handle at the bottom of the front panel is close enough to ground level that grasping it and pulling will skin some knuckles. This handle is also an unfiltered hole in the front panel, which is mostly blocked by the 200mm stock fans and their frames, but will cause problems with dust ingress if smaller fans are used. Radiator mounting on the top of the chassis is extremely flexible, to a fault. There are 9 rows of screw holes next to each other, so that fans and radiators can be offset various distances from the motherboard, but that only leaves 4.5 centimeters of clear, contiguous space between the rails to push the air through. The front panel suffers from the same problem to a lesser degree. Much of the rear surface of the big 200mm intake fans are blocked by the chassis. The case will indeed fit a 360mm rad at the top, but it requires either removing the front I/O assembly or just leaving that end of the radiator unsupported. Mounting at the front of the case is more straightforward, but installing a radiator will require mounting the fans on the outside of the chassis, like the stock fans are, or removing the hard drive cage. The stock 200mm fans should not be installed on a radiator, maybe if it's a 200mm radiator like that one that Cooler Master made. So users who install a normal sized radiator may want to move the 200mm fans to the top instead. But only one 200mm fan can fit here, again thanks to the intricate design of the top panel. Keen-eyed viewers may have noticed that Thermaltake not only claims support for 360mm radiators at the top and front of the case, but also, but also the right of the case, by which they mean the rails that are meant for mounting the hard drive cage. There's no path to the exterior of the case from this location. There's zero ventilation. That's not hyperbole. It's literally zero. So it should go without saying that putting a radiator here would be monumentally stupid. We can only assume Thermaltake copy-pasted the spec sheet for a case with a side vent and forgot to backspace that line. Seriously, that's actually possible, and hopefully that's what happened. Under no circumstances should anybody install a radiator there. This is a large chassis, one that was originally designed to fit 5¼ inch drives, and there's plenty of wide, flat space in front of the motherboard. We'd like to see Thermaltake tap a couple extra screw holes and list compatibility with EEB boards, but it would require some rearrangement of the hard drive cage mounting holes, so it's understandable why they didn't bother, sort of. The hard drive cage, or the hard drive rack as Thermaltake calls it, can be installed at 4 different heights. The bottom mounting location makes the most sense for keeping the case tidy, but repositioning the cage may help clear some space for installing radiators correctly with tubes down. We haven't seen any extra hard drive racks for sale, so as far as we're aware, the 2 bays that come with the case are what you get, which is a bummer for anyone who wants to use more than 3 hard drives. The partial power supply shroud that can't really be used to store any cables, and the flat motherboard tray that doesn't bow out at the front for extra cable management room means that the vast majority of cables must be bundled up against the back of the motherboard tray. The space behind the tray is therefore relatively wide, almost 3.5 centimeters across the entire case. This does have the unfortunate side effect of reducing the width available for the rear exhaust fan, so the rear mount can only support 120mm fans. But in a case where static pressure is at a premium, this isn't the worst thing. The Level 20 RS comes with a pre-installed vertical GPU bracket above the power supply shroud, which we removed for testing. Generally, we try to leave cases completely stock for baseline testing, but this bracket is in the path of airflow and serves no purpose unless there are vertical GPUs mounted in the case. So we removed it for all tests since that's what a real user would do. The only additional test we added on top of the usual set was a pass with 1 layer of mesh removed from the front panel. It's not difficult to get this filter layer out, and it doesn't alter the appearance of the case, but it does require disassembling the front panel and bending and unbending the fragile metal tabs that aren't designed to be reusable. It's difficult to decide how much credit to give Thermaltake for the results achieved with this mesh removed. It's an easy mod, but it's not part of the intended functionality of the case. We'll start with our torture benchmark and just the Thermaltake Level 20 RS compared against itself and the other recent Level 20 product, the MT. We'll look at comparative charts versus competitors in a moment. The Level 20 RS averaged 57 degrees Celsius DT over ambient with the stock layout, with a drop down to 48 C delta T average with the front panel removed. We used the test with no front panel as an indicator of what the best possible performance could be with no obstructions to the front fans whatsoever, and huge temperature drops like this aren't uncommon. The real indicator of a problem is the test we did with the extra layer of mesh removed. which averaged 51 degrees Celsius CPU temperature delta T over ambient. That's about a 6-degree drop just from removing a filter that we didn't believe needed to be there at all to begin with, bringing it fairly close to the temperature that could have been achieved with no front panel whatsoever. The 200mm 600 RPM front fans can't effectively pull air through these two layers of mesh. And again, there's no way to control the speed of these fans. For a mesh-fronted case with two 200mm fans, 57C delta T over ambient is just plain bad. The obvious point of comparison is Cooler Master's line of fixed H500 cases in our comparative chart, and those followed the original H500P, which was not only offensively bad in thermals, but also in assembly. And cue the clip of it falling apart for more of that. Compared to the Level 20 RS, even the H500P original case averaged a degree cooler than the Thermaltake case in this test, at 56C DT. The H500 blank managed 50 degrees delta T over ambient, and the H500M with the mesh front panel applied is one of the best results on the chart at 46 degrees Celsius delta T. Of these, the H500 blank is the closest to the Level 20 RS in price, and it handily outperforms Thermaltake's case. The 51C result with a single layer of mesh removed would put the Level 20 RS in competition with Cooler Master's cases and some of the other airflow-focused cases on the chart. But again, that's not the way this ships, and we're reluctant to say the case performs well based on a mod. Again, like we noticed for the Thermaltake G21. GPU temperature over ambient during the same torture test was 52 degrees Celsius average, which was unchanged by either removing the single layer of mesh or the entire front panel in the only RS chart. A combination of factors led to this, like the fact that the GPU increases clocks when it has thermal headroom, changing air patterns and pressure within the case when the front panel is removed, and the fact that the bottom intake fan may have a little more air available to it thanks to the hole at the bottom of the front panel. In any case, the result was a consistent 52C DT average across the board. Comparatively, the Level 20 RS places much better versus other cases with GPU temperatures than it does with average CPU temperatures. 52C GPU DT is still a couple degrees warmer than the H500 and H500M's 49C DT, but the original H500P averaged 55 degrees Celsius here. So at least Thermaltake's model outperforms a case that we explicitly criticized for dragging down Cooler Master's high airflow line, as it was called. It's appropriately near other mesh-fronted cases like the Be Quiet 500DX and the Phanteks P400A, although the latter still beats it by a couple degrees. With one less layer of mesh in the front panel, the Level 20 RS would be a decently cooled case. Although even then, we'd miss the ability to control the speed of the case fans. Our Firestrike test is next, showing what a gaming workload looks like. Yet again, the average GPU temperature in this test was 52C. If nothing else, the Level 20 RS is extremely consistent here. The Firestrike GPU deltas are usually pretty close to the torture test GPU deltas, so this 52C average is comparatively better than its CPU performance here as well. Cooler Master's H500 averaged 49C DT, while the H500M with the mesh front averaged 52C. These results confirm what we found in the torture test. Thermaltake has done fair to well on GPU cooling, and the shortened, well-ventilated PSU shroud and the ventilation cut into the bottom of the case means that the bottom of the case isn't a sealed-off chamber, so that's what's helping it here. Blender provides an example of a real-world heavy workload that's gentler than Prime 95, which we used for the torture test. CPU temperature during the CPU-only render was 40 degrees Celsius over ambient, putting the Level 20 RS again among the warmest cases in the chart, but not at a level where it's completely out of control. For context, the Bitphoenix Enso, one of the most poorly ventilated cases we've ever reviewed, averaged only a couple degrees warmer at 42 degrees Celsius. Those 2 degrees of change, it's more significant in this case than in the torture test due to the relatively narrow range of results. But in spite of being a bit cooler than that, the Level 20 RS is still absolutely at the warm end of the chart. The Cooler Master H500 did particularly well in this test with an average CPU DT of 36, among the best results we've recorded. GPU thermals in Blender look actually very strong for the Level 20 RS, positioning it at 24 degrees DT over ambient, or in the top third of results on this truncated chart. That's next to some other high performers on the chart. When the case isn't under as much CPU thermal strain, it's much more competitive. Our next chart is for noise. There are 3 fans in the Level 20 RS. 2 of them are 200mm fans that are externally locked to 600 RPM, and one of them is a 120mm rear exhaust fan that maxes out at 1000 RPM. Ours reported approximately 1060. We plugged the rear exhaust fan into the motherboard for manual control as we always do, but the case ships with the fan plugged into the same hub as the front fans, where it too will be locked to 100% all the time. For the first time in a long time, we're in a position where the noise levels we log at 100% fan speeds, for the case fans that is, are the actual noise levels that should be expected from the case at all times stock. We measured it to be 36.1 dBA, which is so close to the 36 dBA noise normalized threshold for our testing that we can treat the stock torture results as comparable on the noise normalized chart. The original 57 degrees Celsius CPU results from the torture test stacks up much better against the noise normalized cases, although that still only pushes it to about the middle of the chart. The Fractal Meshify C scored similarly, and the stock configured Meshify C isn't even thermally impressive without those extra fans. Removing a layer of mesh from the level 20 RS wouldn't have a major impact on noise levels. And the 51 degree average from that test would be one of the best noise normalized results recorded thus far. Thermaltake was that close to having a chart-topping performer. The GPU temperature from this same chart is exceptional compared against the rest of the cases on it. Among the cases using entirely stock layouts, we use our own fans for the O11XL, mind you, the level 20 RS is tied with the P400A for second best GPU temperature on the chart. First place still goes to the ancient DIY PCs onto O, which has an old school side intake fan aimed directly at the GPU. Our next chart is for standardized fan testing, which is something that our viewers always ask for. Please note that there are several flaws to this approach to testing, and we've resolved a lot of them, but there are some that are inherent to it that can't be removed, and that's why we resisted adding it for so long. That said, it can be useful in building the full picture, and to learn why it's not as useful as people would like it to be, check our description for links to the methodology post on the standardized fan testing. For the standardized fan test, we replaced the two 200mm front intakes with our usual Noctua 140 fans and the rear exhaust fan with the Noctua 120. We mounted the front intake fans on the outside of the chassis, since that's the way Thermaltake mounts their stock 200s. No mesh or filters were removed for this test. CPU temperature averaged 53°C, another unimpressive result for a case with an airflow-focused front panel. Other mesh-fronted cases like the PureBase 500DX and P400A averaged 46°C DT and 44°C DT respectively, with the level 20 RS landing closer to the Lian Li Landcool 2 and the ROG Strix Helios. This confirms that the relatively slow front fans aren't the only problem. Even with smaller, higher RPM fans, it's the dual mesh layers of the front panel that prove too restrictive to breathe. GPU temperature averaged 51°C in this test, the only deviation we saw from the 52°C result in the other tests, although even this is within margin of error of the original torture test. It's tied with the PureBase 500DX and the Phanteks P400A, two very good cases that regularly outperform it in CPU thermals, which is a good place to be. By designing a case like this, Thermaltake is obviously, this is blocking all of my light, I've just realized, Thermaltake is obviously inviting comparisons to Cooler Master's cases. Cooler Master isn't the only company that's making cases with 200mm fans, but they're the one that comes to the forefront of anyone's mind when you start looking at these, because they've been putting out H500 whatever cases for a couple of years now, and at least 3 years at this point, not counting the original series of like HAF X style cases. So availability and prices are constantly fluctuating. There's usually a member of the H500 family though available around the price of this, which is about $150 at least right now. So the level 20 RS ends up most directly competing with the Cooler Master H500P mesh, not to be confused with the original H500P. The H500P mesh is actually good in a lot of ways. They fixed the issue where all the panels fell apart. They fixed the issues with thermals. And that's one that we did a big review on a couple of years ago if you're interested in more. And that's $160 right now with $20 rebate. So it's a direct competitor to this case today. Other ones are also around the area. The H500 blank is a bit cheaper. It's also 200mm front fans, and two of them. And it's got a mesh or an acrylic option if you like to suffocate your system. So Thermaltake has direct competition in the 200mm market. They also have competition from the likes of Phanteks with the P400A, which is a lot cheaper for the digital version with all the fans, and also a really strong performer. We gave it best overall for 2019. The P400A has an older style interior. It's really not modern. It feels old when you work with it, but the case itself is good. This also has an older style interior, so that's another direct competitor. Basically, we'd recommend looking at, as an alternative to this, if you are interested in this but maybe don't want this one or you want to know your options, H500P mesh, P400A, and probably H500 blank would be where to start with it. Maybe you might be interested in the SilverStone Farah R1 also, But this one is just, it's got good radiator support and sometimes a little too good, like the side panel. But that's something that Thermaltake tends to focus on. It's also got a lot of weird oversights, like the top where you have to disassemble the entire front, the I/O, which is in a lot of ways only done the way it is to be different from the previous case, just to get all the screws in at the front of a 360 in the top. You have to worry about clearance with VRM heatsinks in instances of wider radiators. You've got a significant portion of the top holes blocked by all of the different support for radiators. So it's support to a fault, but water cooling support is typically what Thermaltake tries to do. So anyway, that's level 20 RS. It is certainly not an easy recommendation. It's not necessarily a recommendation at all from us. It can be really good, but it's not really their stock. And definitely take out the extra mesh layer if you feel like it, because it blocks a lot of the air for the CPU intake, especially for a tower cooler. Once you go water, you brute force a lot of it. Doesn't matter as much, but it still matters. So that's it for this one. Not very competitive overall, but extremely competitive in GPU thermals. Overall, though, you gotta look at the whole picture, and it needs a little bit of help. So thanks for watching. Subscribe for more as always. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus. We'll see you all next time.